So I thought I would put together for you a little bit of data just to show you how strange the history of the Orion Nebula actually is. And I've got this article here called Orion Nebula, Where in History Is It? This is by NASA Astrophysics Data System. And I'm going to do a little bit of reading in this, and then I'm going to hop over to some other things. I'm going to show you how I believe that the Orion Nebula does tie to the 26,000-year cycle, and actually, indeed, this 5,000-year cycle that the Mayans talk about. So let's take a look at how odd or how strange the history of the Orion Nebula is. There definitely seems to be some kind of evidence of cover-up of the Orion Nebula, as you will see as I get through this data for you. So let's take a look at this article real quick. Since this article is rather long, I'm going to be doing a little bit of skipping through it for you, so I can save you with the boring parts. But it says here, today the visible nebula is certainly one of the most conspicuous deep space objects in the sky, and it is a commonly accepted fact that it is a naked eye object, and it can easily be distinguished as non-stellar in appearance by even the untrained eye under dark sky conditions with high contrast. I have quizzed numerous students untrained in astronomy about the Orion Nebula and its appearance during field trips, trying to determine if in fact the nebula can be distinguished as different or fuzzy in its appearance in comparison to other nearby stars. The results have always turned out the same way, that by using naked sky observations, even the untrained observers describe the Orion Nebula as being nebulous in appearance. The same is true of young school-aged children, who do not know exactly what nebulous means, but certainly see the sword of Orion as looking smudgy as compared to nearby stars. Skipping down, in spite of all this, however, a historical study of the Orion Nebula reveals that it has an exceedingly strange ancestry, which is enshrouded as a mystery, as are the trapezium stars enveloped by the mists of the nebula. T.W. Webb hints of Orion's mysterious past. When continuing on with his comments, he says in full, one of the most wonderful objects in the heavens, readily visible to the naked eye, yet strangely missed, as Humboldt says, by Galileo, who paid great attention to Orion. The discovery of the Orion Nebula, indeed it seems extremely odd that such a conspicuous object had to be discovered at all, is not attributed to the great Galileo, who, as we will later see, did pay great attention to the entire constellation of Orion, but his discovery is credited to Nicolas Perret in the year 1610. Slightly more than 1 year after Galileo used his first telescope, during which time Galileo was engaged in writing his classic Sidereus Nuncius, the sidereal messenger. It seems that no reference to the Orion Nebula having been prior to this date by observers in Europe, the Middle East, or Orient exists. History is, in fact, totally silent concerning the misty cloud in the sword of Orion before year 1610. You might also know, quite interestingly, that the year 1611 is when they published the first King James Bible. Just happened to notice that. But anyways, in view of the ease with which it can be seen today by anyone who cares to examine that part of the sky dominated by the warrior Orion, a strong historical case can be made for the Orion Nebula not to have been visibly shining before 1610, making it less than 400 years old and one of the youngest deep space objects seen in the sky today. The observations of Galileo. The observations of Galileo, 1564 to 1642, are crucial to understanding the condition of the Orion Nebula during the early part of the 17th century. Galileo constructed his first telescope during the first few months of 1609 and began his observations during the summer of that year. Skipping down, Figure 1 is a reproduction of Galileo's sky map of Orion in the area of the belt and the sword, as taken from Sidereus Nuncius. Although the star arrangement is difficult to reconcile with modern-day plots of the same area, most of the brightest stars can be recognized. And in fact, Galileo clearly states in his notes that he is depicting the arrangement of stars seen in the vicinity of the belt of the sword of Orion. Clearly, there is no indication of the nebulosity in the region of the sword, nor does Galileo make any mention of such object in the text of Sidereal Messenger. Gendrich, 1983 private communication, however, points out that Galileo did sketch a seemingly nebulous object as depicted on page 964 of the Galileo National Edition. This sketch was taken from his unpublished original notes, but apparently is not related to the sword of region of Orion, since the orientation and arrangement of stars shown is not correct. It's not that Galileo is not aware of the meaning of the significance of the term nebulosity when used in relation to celestial bodies, since he does in fact make mention of a nebula in Orion. To quote the Saudra Messenger, "I have observed some of the nebula, and I wish to subjoin the star clusters of the two nebula. First, you have a diagram of the nebula called that of the Orion's head, in which I have counted 21 stars." His purpose here is to refute the long-held belief that Orion's head is a nebula. Skipping down, it is conceivable in the view of faint stars that he claimed to have seen that Galileo would have either overlooked or ignored the sword nebula. Galileo was not one to mince words or be timid about exclaiming or newly discovered, if not unfamiliar objects. And it is difficult to accept the idea that he would deliberately ignore the nebula, especially since he was so careful to examine the sword region in such detail. Even though his telescope was not one of the quality of modern-day instruments, it need not to have been in order to have provided the best possible resolution for sighting the great nebula, for it only needed to gather in the necessary light, and in the view of faint stars he recorded, there is no question that the telescope he used was sufficient for the task. This is particularly reasonable since Galileo himself mentions that as seen through his telescope, stars of 5th or 6th magnitude are seen as 1st magnitude, which would make the Orion Nebula especially prominent. Furthermore, Giovanni Bartoli in 1609 September testifies to the high caliber of Galileo's telescopes, which were claimed to be superior in terms of image quality to any others on the market at that time. In a letter dated 1610, March 19th, Galileo himself referred to the hundreds of telescopes he had made so far, only a few of which he claimed were suitable for astronomical observations. Also, his telescope's field of view was clearly adequate for including the entire nebula, since he described in a letter dated 1609 to Christopher Clavio the need for a wide field view of observing stars and how to get it. Clearly, if he could observe lunar earthshine with his telescope, then he had sufficient sensitivity for detecting the nebula around Orion's sword. In 1610 November, Perret received his first telescope from an unknown source, possibly his brother in Paris, and was not too long after when his observatory at Aix house a total of 5 instruments of high caliber. Skipping down, according to Humbert, Perret's biographer, on 1610 of November 26th. Wow, that would be November 26th today. The day after using a telescope for the first time, Perret was scanning the constellation Orion and was surprised to find the middle star in the sword surrounded by a small illuminated cloud. He continued his observations of Theta Orionis from December 4th to December 10th, making notes on the appearance of the nebulosity. There are 2 important considerations concerning Perret's observations. First, that he was surprised to see the nebula, clearly establishing that it was uncommon sight and something which probably was not previously seen, and second, that he discovered the nebula so quickly after scanning Orion, just having observed Jupiter for the first time the day before, suggesting that it was not so inconspicuous as one might expect at this time when viewed through a telescope. Today we know that even through a small pair of field glasses, there is something nebulous about the middle star and the sword of Orion. But a third, more important implication is that it was a small illuminated cloud, which indeed it may have been if it was just in the process of brightening. At this point it may not have reached its present-day luminosity, and thus may only have been detectable through the telescope, although clearly so. We are reminded that Galileo had observed the same part of the sky, examining closely the sword region of Orion with telescopes of equal power, and had seen no nebulosity, or presumably so, and he did this just 1 year before Perret started his observations. After 1610, Perret made no further mention of the Orion Nebula. There was, however, another isolated observation made in 1618 by the Jesuit astronomer Johann Baptist Cysat. This was recorded only 6 years after Perret made his discovery of the nebula, but a detailed study of the nebula was not made until the publication of Systema Saturnium by Christian Huygens in 1659, fully 50 years after M42 was first observed. So as you can see, as we're going through this article, it's just one mistake, one overlooking after the next. I mean, these guys, Galileo clearly missed it. These other guys clearly missed it. When they did log stars, they missed stars. And this was not normal for them to do this. And then this Jesuit guy comes along and clearly identifies it as the last star when it's the second star. So there's this very interesting thing going on here. And no one had seen it, apparently, before 1610. Now, if you've ever looked in the center of the Orion Nebula, there are these trapezium stars that you see right here in the very brightest area. And this is what seems to be the confusion, that they're saying that some of these actually brightened up possibly a lot quicker. They're calling them FU stars. So I'm going to skip here to the conclusion, and it says, we have attempted to present historical evidence that the great nebula M42 and Orion only reached the naked eye visibility around 1609 to 1610, before which time it seemed to be subluminous, to the point where it was missed by many astute observers of the heavens. Even Galileo, who studied Orion carefully through a small but sufficiently powerful telescope, missed the nebula. The evidence suggests that nebula brightened rather slowly since Nicolas Pereira first reported the nebula as being small in 1610, while expressing his surprise at even seeing a nebula in the sort of region of Orion. Likewise, 6 years later, Johann Sisat, after observing M42 through a telescope, erred in reporting its position, suggesting that it may not have even been bright enough for a non-telescope visual confirmation. Today, we readily acknowledge the Sword Nebula as a naked eye object. This is easily verified by polling observing groups taken into the field without any previous knowledge of Orion, the majority of which will usually confirm without hesitation the cloudiness of Theta Orionis region. Those with the sharpest eyesight can easily see the nebulosity, and thus it is difficult to believe that such a conspicuous object was missed by careful observers such as Al-Sufi in the 10th century and Galileo in the 17th century, and Tycho Brahe, who observed Orion in the 16th century. Observers are uniformly silent on the Orion Nebula for a period of time spanning more than 2,000 years, during which time no reference is made to a misty or cloudy appearance of the region of Theta Orionis. Right here I'm on the Messier star catalog site. It has the history of all of the recorded nebula and stars, and when we go to M42, which is the Orion Nebula, if we skip down here just a little bit, it says that all these discoveries apparently got lost for some time, so that eventually Christian Huygens was wrongly credited for his independent rediscovery in 1656. It is somewhat unusual. I mean, this word unusual, odd, strange is just surrounding the Orion Nebula, and you don't see this in any other star cluster or nebula or anything else. It says it's somewhat unusual that the Orion Nebula has found its way into the Messier list together with the bright star cluster M44 and the Pleiades M45. Charles Messier usually only included fainter objects which could be easily taken for comets. And so when we click on that part that said that it got lost for some time, right here it says all these discoveries didn't get publicly known but were forgotten for a considerable period of time. Consequently, the independent rediscovery by Christian Huygens of 1656 was longly considered original. It says it was not before 1854 that Rudolf Wolff found and published Sisata's discovery. So all this from 1610, and then all the records get lost. There's all these weird things surrounding the Orion Nebula. These guys aren't seeing it in the sky. And then, so on top of all of this, so the Mayan sacred Bible is called the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh is a book written in the middle of the 16th century. That would be the 1500s. And so this would obviously be quite some time before they discovered the Orion Nebula, either with or without a telescope. Apparently they couldn't see it with either. So we get to Mayan cosmology, and we find out that the world creation is described, and this is on AuthenticMaya.com, the world creation is described in the Popol Vuh, the Bible of the Maya. This book was found in the 16th century, hidden in a Catholic church altar, written quiche. So it was hidden in a Catholic church altar. So here's what it says at the top here. It says in AD 775, the Maya lord Kak Tilu Chan Yot, fire-burning sky lightning god, set up an immense stone monument in the center of his city. In Guatemala, the unimaginative archaeologists who discovered the stone called it Stella C. The monument bears the longest hieroglyphic description of the Maya creation myth, noting that it had taken place on the Mayan calendar's day 13,000 4 Aha 8 Kumku, a date corresponding, everybody should be familiar with this date, August 13th, 3014 BC on our calendar. This date appears over and over in other inscriptions throughout the Maya world. On that day, the Creator God set 3 stones, or 3 mountains, in the sky, after lifting it with the sacred tree of life from the dark waters that once covered the primordial world. These 3 stones formed a cosmic hearth at the center of the universe. These gods then struck the divine new fire by means of lightning, which charged the new world with new life. That's something to pay attention to. Using lightning, the divine new fire by means of lightning, it charged the world with new life. It's talking about resurrection there. Now here's a little animation showing Orion. It's showing the 3 hearthstones, and it shows the fire in the hearth, the fire lightning god that basically caused a resurrection to occur by restoring new life. They call it the New Fire Ceremony. And I believe that the Orion Nebula, from what I'm seeing here, more than likely, I'm going to take a stab here, I'm going to guess and say that something comes from that area of the cosmos and causes some kind of a resurrection or something to occur in us. It probably hits us with some kind of either some kind of a light, some kind of energy, something that causes some kind of a resurrection or higher consciousness to occur in us. And you remember that NASA just came up with a something that's saying that there is a black hole, which whatever we want to call a black hole, nobody really knows what it is. But it definitely could be some area containing a large amount of energy. And so this is what the Mayans call their creation area, right in the center of these 3 hearthstones right here, which is the Orion Nebula. It says a triadic structure is one that consists of 3 buildings, a main central building and 2 smaller buildings, each flanking a side of the main structure and facing each other. There is an abundance of triadic structures at El Mirador. El Tigre complex has 2 triadic structures. Structure 34 on the top of the Great Tigre Pyramid is a triadic structure. Let's see. What archaeologist Richard Hansen believes is that the triadic pattern was a representation of the Mayans' creation myth. It portrayed the place of origin, which they represent in everyday life as well as Maya home. These 3 stones, known as the 3 hearthstones, are found in every Maya kitchen every today, where the fire they cook in creates a celestial image. Other Maya archaeologists dedicate much thought to these questions. The following quotes bibliography specially recommended and essential reading for everyone interested in this. And this is a very interesting quote right here. The act of seating the stones in the triangular pattern of the hearth created an image on the face of the earth and in the sky at the same time. Now, I have shown you that the Orion Nebula overlays on top of the earth, and it shows the same image in the Orion Nebula that we see on Earth. Now right here on my cosmological creation, it says that just as the 3 stones of the hearth in Maya surround the fire, their celestial counterparts form the place of the celestial fire where stars are born and the Hunal Nalye, the Maya maize god, is resurrected. Now, the maize god is interesting because Osiris is associated with maize. In fact, when they celebrate his resurrection every year, or when they did in Jedu, they celebrated it with cornbread and ale. And so he is associated with the maize god. And you'll also find the maize god inside the Roslyn Chapel as well. Well, skipping right down here, as it is really beyond our scope of work, but we hope our readers at Mirado Park will have a better understanding on what is meant when we say that the essential Maya myth is transposed to the pre-classic Maya ceremonial architecture at El Mirador, and of what the symbolism of the triadic pattern represents. A deep belief that the Maya had in everything is sacred, and that thy will be done on earth as thou art in heaven. And it looks like they also believed, they had a belief system on the triadic structures they built as undeniable and reflected in the celestial pattern in their architecture and in the 3 hearthstones placed in every kitchen's fire. Okay, so what we're seeing here in all of this is that the Mayans knew about the Orion Nebula before they knew about it with telescopes. It's very clear. They even had a history associated with it. And it's a history associated with creation. And they know that this is the fire in the hearth. And what's even more interesting is they knew that it is a big lightning bolt of some sort. And they say it has something to do with resurrection of the maize god. And if you know anything about the maize god and Osiris, which they should be teaching in astrotheology, but I'm not seeing it happen, the very most important constellation to the ancients, that was the Orion constellation, I'm not seeing being taught in astrotheology, which is actually a shame. It should be, because what this area represents is it represents a macrocosm version of ourselves. And if I had to take a stab or a guess at anything, I wouldn't give a specific date, but I would say that sometime soon, I'm guessing, is that we might actually see some kind of interesting activity around the Orion Nebula. I find it interesting that the Orion Nebula got brighter apparently in 1610. That was right somewhere around the Renaissance period, if I'm not mistaken. Mayans associate it to the very center, or the navel of the world, right? And this trapezium that you see right here just so happens to be right in the very center of the land masses of the planet. So what you see right here, when I click on this, for example, this Nile Delta, which is where the trapezium area is, happens to be the very, very center of the planet. It's of all the land masses. And it also has copied it just like it is in the sky. And as I've shown you before, this stuff goes all the way back a long time ago. They knew about the Orion Nebula, see, at least subconsciously. We've known about it all the way back until at least 1500. These people have been pouring it out on the canvas for a long time. So all these weird things that are happening with the Orion Nebula, people should be waking up and paying attention to it, especially since it is specifically mentioned in the new fire ceremony, the new restoring life to everybody on the planet in the coming new age. So these are the 3 hearthstones of creation. This is Rigel, Alnitak, and Scythe. And this is what they call the fire in the middle, smoke from the hearth. This is the area of creation. Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but when you take a look at the name pyramid is Greek, and it means fire within or fire in there. It actually means fire in the middle. Pyramid, fire in the middle. And when we take a look in the pyramid text, and right now I'm on grahamhancock.com, but also if you take a look at the Gospel of Thomas, and you take a look at the word fire in there, it says, on 82, it says, Jesus said, "He who is near me is near the fire, and he who is far from me is far from the kingdom." This is all representative, because we have Jesus, we have the maize god that resurrected, and then Osiris is also a resurrection god. And in the pyramid texts, utterance 600, we see this king is Osiris, this pyramid of the king is Osiris, this construction of his is Osiris. So what I'm seeing here is a correlation between all of these different resurrection gods that all appear to be the same. And there appears to be some kind of an association, because to us, actually, because the construction of the pyramid is the construction of Osiris, but what actually Osiris is representing is not an external god. Neither is Jesus, neither is Mithra. These are all resurrection gods, and they are all associated to Orion. And so we see that this resurrection that's supposed to occur, just like the resurrection that occurred in Jesus, the crucifixion, was in a place called Golgotha, which is an Aramaic word that means place of the skull. And this is what I'm seeing here, is that there is a direct correlation between the Orion Nebula, what is in our head, and this resurrection that's going to occur, that the Mayans are talking about. It happens each age. So I think it would behoove us to start paying more attention to the Orion Nebula, and I would highly suggest that if you are following astrotheology from anybody, that if they are not covering the Orion constellation, which Graham Hancock and many world-renowned researchers have clearly said was the very most important constellation in ancient cultures, that they start covering it. And start covering Osiris too, because Osiris is not anything about some external god. It is the representation of us when we move through the various planets, and which is Jacob's ladder to the stars that Manly Hall talks about as well. That's about all I want to cover in this real quick, but I wanted to show you the mysterious nature and history of the Orion Nebula, and show you how it ties to 2012 in the Mayan calendar and the resurrection of us spiritually. This can be found if you just do a little bit of research. You can find that this confirms itself all over the place. So maybe something interesting is going to happen with the Orion Nebula soon, especially since they just found this so-called black hole in it. Maybe they already knew about it. Maybe they knew something was coming. Who knows? Y'all take care. I'll talk to you soon.